Okay, so today we are talking about the critical evaluation of perspectives. Obviously, we have our three perspectives: functionalist perspective, conflict theory perspective, and interactionist perspective. So all of these perspectives are going to have criticisms, and that's not really a surprise. We're not talking about something nearly as provable as other sciences like physics or chemistry when we talk about this, talk about sociology, right? You're not going to have similar criticisms of something like physics when you say, well, what happens when you drop something? Does it fall down to the ground? Is that gravity? Like, we're going to have less critical things about that. But when things are more difficult to measure and we're talking about how much and to what extent does society play a role in our lives, that's going to be much more difficult to measure. And so we're always going to have criticisms. And so, starting with functionalist perspective, the criticism is that it's too broad. It ignores inequalities of social class, race, and gender to focus on stability at the expense of conflict. So this is basically just saying, well, why don't we all just try to get along? Why don't we all just not let these sort of things bother us? Like, we're trying not to have conflict, we're trying to have stability instead, and really conflict leads to a lack of stability. And so if you say conflict leads to a lack of stability, maybe what we should do is we should just look at the way that things are and just try to avoid that sort of conflict. Well, it's not necessarily good, because there might be inequalities in some of these areas, and with the inequalities we need to make sure that we are sensitive to those and that we're able to deal with those things. Okay, so functionalist perspective is too broad. Excuse me. I'm going to skip to interactionist perspective, and then we'll do conflict theory last. Uh, Interactionist perspective is too narrow. It ignores larger societal structures, effects of culture, factors such as class, gender, and race. So basically, this is going to we're looking maybe at the way these groups interact with one another and the way people interact within these groups, but we're not being we're not being conscious as we should be of social structure, culture, factors such as class, gender, and race. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. Now, last thing I want to talk about is conflict theory. Now, if you remember conflict theory, we talked about Marx, and we talked about how in conflict theory, there's always going to be these two competing groups, and one group is the oppressors and one group is the oppressed. Or to put another way, one group, according to Marx, the capitalists are the oppressors, and the workers are the oppressed. You could also have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These are all different words for the same thing, which is basically that people are competing for resources within a society. And the critical evaluation of conflict theory is obviously that it's too broad, but it ignores how shared values and mutual interdependence unify society. So I'm going to talk about that for just a second. Um, you could say that Marxism is not. You could say that it's not right because of the fact that just by virtue of being a member of an oppressor group, that doesn't make one an oppressor, right? So if you say such and such race is the oppressor group, the way conflict theory would, then that means that nothing can be changed besides the like once you're born into that body, you are part of that group, and then that is who you are. And it totally removes individual accountability from the situation, right? If you have the characteristics of somebody from an oppressor group, you could say, well, I'm just part of the oppressor group, and so I don't have any individual accountability. And then if you are somebody who's part of the group that has been labeled by conflict theory as an oppressed group, then it removes the accountability, and you think the world is against you and you can't get ahead. So it's important with conflict theory um, to understand that when we try to apply conflict theory, what we have is this general feeling of like in the 20th century, 100 million people died of starvation as a result of conflict theory policies of communism. because if the plan is that we're going to have a conflict and we're going to compete for resources, well, if we know ahead of time that we're going to compete for resources and there's going to be war between classes, then we're not going to try to get along together in those classes. And the last thing is that it pursues political goals. A lot of times, members of people who espouse conflict theory, people who promote conflict theory, they're trying to do so as means to a political end. They're trying to gain power for themselves by telling certain classes of people that they are constantly oppressed. So if you say your group is oppressed, then people are going to uh, they're gonna try to give political power to the person who's going to be seen as their liberator. And whether or not the oppression is true in the current context, that is it's being used as a to pursue political goals. Okay, so those are sort of the critical evaluations of each of those, and we will talk about the rest on Monday.